The Indiana Fever were not just losing. They were a dying brand, a franchise rotting from the inside out, caught in the gravity of a decade-long decay that no lottery pick could fix. For years, the Fever had been the WNBA's basement, a place where talent went to stagnate and dreams went to die in front of empty seats. But in the spring of 2024, the narrative shifted from pity to a calculated, aggressive hostility. The arrival of Caitlin Clark didn't just bring hope, it brought a target. Let's be clear about the winner and the loser this opening act. The winner was a 22-year-old from Iowa who carried the weight of an entire league on her shoulders. The loser, every single person who believed that the Caitlin Clark effect would be a fleeting social media trend that would crumble under the physicality of grown women. They were waiting for her. The Vultures. You saw them on every major network and in every corner of the digital space. Pundits, former legends, and rival players, circling the Indiana Fever like they were a fresh carcass. They weren't just skeptical, they were predatory. They prayed for the collapse. They used aggressive, condescending language to frame her as a white savior who hadn't paid her dues. A college shooter who would be physically broken by the enforcers of the league. These vultures didn't want a transition period. They wanted a public execution of her hype. They pointed to the 1-8 start as proof of her failure. They weaponized every turnover, every missed logo three, and every hard foul she took as a sign that the old guard was successfully gatekeeping the game. They talked about her like she was a product of marketing rather than a product of work. They were waiting for the locker room to fracture, for the veterans to turn on the rookie, and for the Indiana Fever to return to the silence of the basement. But what the world saw on social media, the hip checks, the technical fouls, the heated press conferences, was only 10% of the truth. While the media was busy debating her rookie treatment, something happened in a closed-door practice session in late May that changed everything. There is a secret moment, hidden from the cameras and the beat reporters, where the hierarchy of the Indiana Fever was dismantled and rebuilt in a single afternoon. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a PR stunt. It was a confrontation. The old guard within the team had to decide if they were going to sink with the Vultures or swim with the girl who was currently the most targeted human being in sports. That day, the chemistry between Kelsey Mitchell and Caitlin Clark didn't just develop, it was forged in a fire that the public wouldn't understand for months. You think you know the story of the Indiana Fever season because you saw the highlights. You don't. You saw the outcome. To understand how Caitlin Clark actually saved this franchise from total annihilation, you have to look at the blood in the water and the woman who refused to stop swimming. Before we can appreciate the salvation, we must understand the depth of the rot. For nearly 10 years, the Indiana Fever were more than just a losing team. They were a cautionary tale of organizational paralysis. This was a franchise that had once tasted the ultimate glory under the leadership of Tamika Catchings. But after her retirement in 2016, the lights didn't just dim, they went out. The Fever entered a period of systemic stagnation that would make most professional athletes question their career choices. We are talking about 7 consecutive seasons without a winning record. We are talking about a cumulative record that looked more like an error message than a professional sports standing. The decay was not just in the box scores, it was in the floorboards of the Gainbridge Fieldhouse. The culture of the Indiana Fever had become one of accepted failure. When you lose for that long, the psychology of the building changes. The Vultures in the media didn't just circle the team because they were bad. They circled because the Fever had become a graveyard for lottery picks. Year after year, the franchise would secure a top 3 draft selection. And year after year, that talent would be swallowed by the void. Whether it was coaching carousels, a lack of identity, or a fundamental disconnect in the front office, the result was always the same. A product that felt stagnant, uninspired, and completely disconnected from the evolution of the modern game. This was the dark years period, between 2017 and 2023. The Fever were the league's punching bag. While teams like the Las Vegas Aces were building super teams and the New York Liberty were reinventing the market, Indiana was stuck in a loop of mediocrity. The fans knew it, the players felt it, and the rest of the league capitalized on it. Playing Indiana was a get-right game for the heavyweights, a night to pad stats and rest starters in the fourth quarter. This wasn't just a lack of talent, it was a lack of gravity. There was no reason for the basketball world to care about Indianapolis. Then came the 2023 season. Aaliyah Boston arrived, bringing a glimmer of hope and the Rookie of the Year trophy. She was the first pillar, a dominant post presence who demanded respect. But even with a generational talent in the paint, the Fever finished 13-27. They were still missing the engine. They were still missing the spark that could turn a collection of players into a cohesive, terrifying unit. The franchise was at a crossroads. They had a foundational piece in Boston and a prolific, yet often isolated, scorer in Kelsey Mitchell. But the connective tissue was non-existent. The decay had created a vacuum. This vacuum was filled with a specific kind of professional apathy. When you represent a brand that is synonymous with the bottom of the standings, your competitive edge begins to erode. The veterans on the squad were battle-worn, having spent years playing in front of crowds that were more interested in the halftime entertainment than the score. The psychological toll being a perennial loser is a weight that few people truly understand. It manifests in slow rotations, hesitant shooting, and a bench that stays seated when a teammate makes a play. That was the Indiana Fever legacy heading into the 2024 draft. They were a franchise that had forgotten how to win, governed by a league that had largely forgotten they existed. The Vultures were already writing the obituary for the 2024 season before it even began, claiming that even the greatest prospect in the history of the sport couldn't fix a foundation this cracked. They argued that the Fever curse would claim Caitlin Clark, just as it had claimed the relevance of the city's basketball identity for the last decade. They didn't realize that for the decay to be cleared, the old structure had to be completely demolished. Clark didn't arrive to renovate the Indiana Fever. She arrived to burn the old culture to the ground and build something unrecognizable on top of the ashes. The darkness of those 7 years wasn't just a streak of bad luck. It was the fuel for the most aggressive, hostile takeover in the history of the WNBA. To the casual observer, an injury is a line item on a report, a medical term followed by a projected timeline. But for the Indiana Fever, in the era of Caitlin Clark, the mounting physical toll was a psychological war of attrition. This wasn't just about strained quads or rolled ankles. It was about the systematic erosion of a dream under the relentless pressure of a world waiting for her to break. By mid-season, the injury nightmare had moved from the trainer's room to the very soul of the roster, creating a vacuum where the Vultures found their most potent ammunition. Imagine the mental state of a 22-year-old who has played every single minute of high-stakes basketball for 4 years, only to enter the most physically punishing league on earth and find her body finally screaming for a ceasefire. In 2025, the nightmare became a reality. Clark, who had been an Iron Woman throughout her college career, began to experience the first time "I haven't felt like a young body." It started with the quad strain, a nagging, biting pain that sapped her explosive first step. Then came the groin injuries. First, the left, then the right, stripping away the lateral quickness that allowed her to escape the trap-heavy defenses designed to bury her. This was the psychological trap. When you are the savior, you do not have the luxury of being day-to-day. For Clark, every game missed was not just a loss for the Fever, it was a victory for the doubters. The mental toll of sitting on that sideline, draped in a towel, watching your teammates struggle without you, while the national media questions your durability, is a specific kind of torture. It is the feeling of being a prisoner in your own jersey. She was dealing with what psychologists call identity foreclosure, where her entire sense of self was so tied to her on-court performance that the inability to play felt like a disappearance of her very existence. The Vultures smelled blood. They didn't see a young athlete managing a grueling schedule. They saw a bust in the making. They claimed she was too small for the professional game, that her body was failing the test of WNBA physicality. The psychological erosion was further exacerbated by the Vulture attack from pundits who suggested she was taking mental breaks disguised as injuries. They weaponized her vulnerability, turning her legitimate physical setbacks into a narrative of mental weakness. They claimed she couldn't handle the bullying and the cheap shots. Inside the locker room, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. When the star is sidelined, the hierarchy becomes unstable. The rest of the Fever roster had to endure the injury arc alongside her, forced to play under a microscope while their leader was in the hyperbaric chamber. The isolation of the training room is where the real injury nightmare lives. It's the hours of red light therapy, the dry needling, and the silent journaling, while the sounds of the game echo from the arena floor. Clark spoke of calling her mother, desperate for the comfort of a home-cooked meal, a rare glimpse into the cracks in her professional armor. She was a kid carrying the weight of a billion-dollar industry, realizing for the first time that her greatest weapon, her availability, was no longer guaranteed. The Vultures circled tighter as the Fever's record dipped in her absence. They mocked the Clark effect, claiming the team was better off without the circus. But the reality was the opposite. The psychological erosion was a shared experience. The team was learning a brutal lesson in empathy. Clark spent those 18 games on the sidelines, not just rehabbing a groin or a bone bruise in her ankle, but observing. She was watching the body language of her teammates from the perspective of a spectator, learning the subtle cues of frustration and the moments where the old guard felt abandoned. This period was the darkest the franchise had seen since the pre-Clark era. The fear wasn't just that they would lose games. The fear was that the golden child was broken permanently. The Vultures were already drafting the what-if articles, preparing to bury the Indiana Fever once again. The psychological toll of being the target of a hostile takeover while being physically unable to defend yourself is a weight that would have crushed a lesser competitor. But in the silence of the rehab sessions, Clark was doing more than healing. She was recalibrating. She was realizing that to save the Fever, she had to stop being just a player and start being a general. The injury didn't end the dream. It stripped away the noise, leaving only the cold, hard necessity of a total mechanical and mental overhaul. The WNBA is not a league where you find your footing. It is a league where you are tested until you break. When Caitlin Clark stepped onto the hardwood of the Gainbridge Fieldhouse, she wasn't just carrying the expectations of a city. She was carrying a target on her back that the Vultures had been sharpening for months. But while the media focused on the logo threes and the sellout crowds, an expert scout would have seen something far more profound happening beneath the surface. To save the Indiana Fever, Clark had to do more than shoot. She had to undergo a complete mechanical and tactical metamorphosis in real time. This was not a gradual transition. It was a high-velocity overhaul of everything she knew about the geometry of the game. In the early weeks of the 24 season, the physicality of the league was a shock to the system. Opposing defenses weren't just guarding her, they were hunting her. They were using the Jordan rules of the 90s hip checks, forearms to the ribs, and relentless full-court pressure designed to suffocate her vision. Her first game was a 10-turnover nightmare, a statistic the Vultures feasted upon as proof that her college game wouldn't translate. But look closer at the film. You see the exact moment the mechanical overhaul began. She realized that in the WNBA, the elevator of space she used to operate in had shrunk by half. To survive, she had to tighten her handles, keeping the ball lower to the floor, navigating within an elevator like a seasoned floor general. Then came the basketball marriage with the mid-range game. In college, Clark was a binary player, either a deep three or a layup. But the WNBA's elite rim protectors, like Aja Wilson and Breanna Stewart, were waiting for her at the cup. The mechanical shift was subtle but lethal. She began to incorporate off-balance, finishing, and isometrics into her routine, working with fever performance coaches to build a low center of gravity. She stopped being an upright shooter and started becoming a coiled spring. We saw the introduction of the floater, a soft-touch weapon that allowed her to punish defenses for dropping back on the screen. She wasn't just taking what the defense gave her, she was manipulating their very positioning. But the most transformative part of the overhaul wasn't the scoring, it was the vision. We are talking about laser vision that turned the Indiana Fever from a stagnant offense into a terrifying transition machine. By July, Clark wasn't just passing, she was throwing people open. She set the WNBA single-game assist record with 19 dimes against the Dallas Wings, a feat that required her to process the floor at a speed the league hadn't seen in decades. She was no longer waiting for teammates to be open. She was predicting where they would be 3 seconds before they arrived. This was the catalyst effect. She forced Aaliyah Boston and Kelsey Mitchell to run harder, to look earlier, and to trust that if they sprinted, the ball would find them perfectly in stride. The statistics tell the story of the overhaul, but the body language tells the story of the leadership. By the time she recorded the first ever rookie triple-double against the New York Liberty, the transformation was complete. She had added 8 pounds of muscle to withstand the Vulture attack. But more importantly, she had added a layer of mental callousness. She stopped complaining to the refs and started punishing the contact. Her three-point range actually increased as her legs got stronger, making her a threat the moment she crossed half-court. This wasn't just a hot streak. This was the sound of a franchise's engine finally turning over after a decade of rust. Clark didn't just join the Fever. She re-engineered them into a team that played at her frequency. The Vultures were still talking about her turnovers, but the league was starting to realize that the girl they tried to break had instead broken the status quo of the game itself. To the outside world, it looked like a conflict of interest. On one side, you had Kelsey Mitchell, the veteran heartbeat, who had survived 7 years of Indiana's darkest winters. On the other, Caitlin Clark, the rookie phenomenon who brought a circus, a spotlight, and a fundamental shift in the team's gravity. The Vultures were banking on a fallout. They predicted that Mitchell, a prolific scorer who had paid her dues in silence, would resent the girl who inherited the keys to the city on day one. But what transpired wasn't a rivalry. It was a basketball marriage that saved the franchise. This partnership didn't just happen. It was a tactical alignment of two of the fastest motors in the history of the league. In the early weeks, they were two soloists playing different songs. Mitchell was used to isolation, to getting her own out of necessity because the system around her was broken. Clark was trying to find the rhythm of a professional game that was trying to physically erase her. But then, the chemistry shifted. It started with a look, a subtle nod in transition where Clark realized that for the first time in her life, she had a teammate who was actually faster than her. We saw the basketball marriage consummate after the Olympic break. And the numbers are staggering. Since July, the Fever boasted the #1 offense in the entire WNBA. When Clark and Mitchell were on the floor together, the offensive rating skyrocketed to a lethal 105.6. They became the first duo in the history of the league to each make over 100 three-pointers in a single season. This wasn't just playing together. This was a symbiotic destruction of opposing backcourts. Clark's laser vision and Mitchell's sonic speed created a pace that felt like a track meet in a basketball gym. Mitchell would later describe the union as a match made in heaven, admitting that Clark's arrival changed the world. This is the psychological breakthrough the Vultures didn't see coming. Mitchell didn't see Clark as a threat. She saw her as a liberator. For 7 years, Mitchell had faced double teams in empty gyms. Now, with Clark's gravity pulling defenders 30 feet away from the hoop, Mitchell found herself in heaven, wide open lanes and one-on-one matchups that she punished with a career-high 19.2 points per game. Look at the body language in the fourth quarter against the Chicago Sky. after a Clark assist to a trailing Mitchell for a corner three. They didn't just high-five, they shared a moment of intense, vocal validation. Mitchell, the veteran who had known what the bottom feels like, was finally exhaling. Clark, the rookie who had been beaten up by the league, was finally being protected. Mitchell became the enforcer and the validator, telling the media that Clark accepted the spotlight with grace. The Vultures tried to frame the narrative as Clark taking over Mitchell's team, but the reality was a hostile takeover of the league by a unified front. Clark provided the orchestration, and Mitchell provided the clutch execution, shooting a blistering 62% in the final 5 minutes of close games. They became the Splash Sisters of the Midwest. A backcourt engine that didn't just save the season, it redefined the ceiling of the Indiana Fever. To see them together was to see a veteran's wisdom meeting a rookie's audacity. A basketball marriage that turned a graveyard into a powerhouse. In the WNBA, respect is not given, it is extracted. When Caitlin Clark entered the league, she didn't just walk into a locker room, she walked into a decade's worth of suppressed resentment and a rigid hierarchy that was not ready for a 22-year-old to become the face of the industry. The Vultures and the media didn't just watch from the sidelines, they were joined by the old guard, a collective of legends and veterans who viewed Clark's arrival not as an opportunity, but as an affront to the dues they had paid in silence. This was the most documented welcome to the league moment in history, and it was a hostile takeover in every sense of the word. The friction started before she even put on the jersey. We saw the reality as coming comments from Diana Taurasi, a blunt assessment that some interpreted as a warning and others as a threat. We heard the voices of legends like Cheryl Swoops, who went on national platforms to question the legitimacy of Clark's scoring records, using factually incorrect data to paint her as a volume shooter who took 40 shots a game. This wasn't just analysis. It was the old guard attempting to set the boundaries. They wanted her to know that while she brought the fans and the private jets, the court still belonged to the women who had been there before the cameras arrived. On the court, the hierarchy defended itself with a physicality that bordered on the theatrical. We saw Chennedy Carter's infamous hip check, a non-basketball play that sent Clark to the hardwood while the opposing bench cheered. We saw J.C. Sheldon catch her in the face and Marina Mabrey deliver a secondary body check that left Clark sprawling. These were not just fouls, they were messages. The Vultures took these moments and spun them into a narrative of rookie hazing. But for Clark, it was a trial by fire. The league was testing her mental toughness, waiting for her to complain, waiting for her to break. But here is where the takeover became hostile. Instead of shrinking, Clark leaned into the friction. She stopped asking for fouls and started playing through the contact, developing a trash-talking badass persona that matched the energy of the veterans. She didn't just survive the physicality, she weaponized it to draw attention to the lack of player protection in the league. She spoke with a level of grace that frustrated her detractors, constantly uplifting the great players of the league, even as they tried to downplay her impact. She understood that to lead the Indiana Fever out of the basement, she had to navigate a political minefield where the commissioner allegedly told other players that Clark should be grateful for her platform. The old guard was trying to preserve a world that was already disappearing, while they focused on the dues she hadn't paid. Clark was busy paying the bills for the entire league. The sellout crowds in Phoenix, the chartered flights, and the record-breaking TV ratings were the currency of her takeover. By the time Diana Taurasi walked back her comments, acknowledging that greatness translates, the power shift was already complete. Clark had bypassed the traditional hierarchy by connecting directly with the fans and delivering on-court results that the Vultures couldn't ignore. She didn't wait for permission to be the face of the WNBA. She took the crown by force, proving that leadership isn't about seniority, it's about who can carry the weight when the lights are the brightest. The Indiana Fever did not just improve in the summer of 2024. They underwent a molecular restructuring. If you look at the standings on July 17th, You see a team that was 13-15 scrappy, but inconsistent, still leaning on the crutches of their old losing habits. But then came the Olympic break, a month of silence that the Vultures assumed would cool the fever's momentum. They were wrong. While the world focused on Paris, the Fever were in Indianapolis, engaged in what head coach Christy Sides described as a recoding of their collective DNA. This was the moment the shift became permanent, and the Indiana Fever emerged as the most dangerous offense in the world. The metamorphosis was visible the second they stepped back onto the court in mid-August. They didn't just win, they hunted. They came out of the gate with an 8-2 record, steamrolling through a schedule that included the Phoenix Mercury and the Seattle Storm. But the shift wasn't found in the final scores, it was found in the micro details of the bench interactions. For years, the Fever bench had been a place of quiet resignation. Now, it was a war room. You saw Lexi Ho, a player the Vultures had written off as a defensive specialist, catching fire for 22 points against Seattle. Look at the tape of that game. Every time Hull hit a three, Clark was the first person off the bench, not just cheering, but directing. She was no longer just a rookie playing a game. She was a conductor managing an orchestra. The data from this period is staggering. Post-Olympic break, the Indiana Fever boasted the second highest offensive rating in the WNBA at 110.4. They weren't just scoring, they were operating with a surgical precision that made the league's old guard look slow. This was the result of the mechanical overhaul reaching its peak. The team stopped reacting to the defense and started forcing the defense to react to them. The basketball marriage between Clark and Mitchell had reached a level of telepathy where they were no longer looking at each other to confirm a play, they simply knew. But the true metamorphosis was psychological. We saw it in the mini-series against the Las Vegas Aces. Even in a loss, the Fever's body language was unrecognizable from the start of the season. They were no longer intimidated by the champions. Kelsey Mitchell spoke about the team learning what it takes to win in a loss, a paradoxical statement that defines elite leadership. They were treating every game like a pre-playoff test, narrowing the margins of error. The Vultures, who had mocked their 1-8 start, were suddenly forced to explain how the worst team in the league had become a top 5 power rankings juggernaut in 90 days. The shift culminated in the clinching of their first playoff berth since 2016. This wasn't a gift, it was a hostile reclamation of their dignity. The team that had once been the WNBA's punching bag was now a squad that forced opposing coaches to call timeouts 36 seconds into the first quarter. They had built an unbreakable chemistry through communication drills and team bonding events that sounds like fluff to the cynical, but on the court, it translated to a defensive rotations that finally clicked and an offensive pace that felt like a relentless wave. Caitlin Clark didn't just save the Fever by making shots. She saved them by raising the floor of what was acceptable. By the end of August, the metamorphosis was complete. The Indiana Fever were no longer a project. They were a problem. In the world of professional sports, we are taught that numbers are the only objective truth. We are told that statistics are the cold, hard receipts of a player's worth. But when you look at the rookie season of Caitlin Clark, the stat sheet was merely a portal into something far more transformative. To understand how she saved the Indiana Fever, you have to look past the ink on the page and realize that she didn't just break records. She shattered the very status quo of what the WNBA believed was possible. For every major milestone she reached, there was a ripple effect that changed the trajectory of the league's history and the economic reality of women's basketball forever. Let's talk about the number 337. 337 assists in a single season. This isn't just a rookie record. This is the all-time WNBA single-season record, surpassing the mark set by legendary veterans who had spent decades mastering the geometry of the professional floor. When Clark dropped 19 assists in a single game against the Dallas Wings, she didn't just set a new bar. She proved that the Indiana Fever had evolved into an offensive engine that operated at a speed the league was physically unprepared to handle. Every one of those 337 assists represented a moment where a teammate, often a veteran who had spent years in the darkness of the Fever's losing culture, was given the easiest basket of her life. Those assists were the fuel that converted a group of isolated players into a unified, high-octane machine. Then, there is the number 769. 769 points, the most ever by a rookie in WNBA history. The Vultures claimed her college scoring wouldn't translate, that the grown women of the league would push her off her spots and force her into a secondary role. Instead, she became the first rookie in history to record over 400 points and 150 assists in a single season. She became the first rookie to ever record a triple-double, and then she did it again. But the 200-word rule of impact tells us that these points weren't just about the score. They were about gravity. Her ability to hit 122 three-pointers in a season, leading the entire league, forced opposing defenses to guard her the moment she stepped off the team bus. This gravity opened up the paint for Aaliyah Boston and created wide-open lanes for Kelsey Mitchell, fundamentally altering the spacing of the WNBA. She didn't just score. She redefined the defensive geography of the entire sport. But the most staggering statistics lived off the court, proving that Clark was a macroeconomic force disguised as a point guard. In 2024, the Indiana Fever went from second to last in attendance to leading the league with over 340,000 fans. This was a 500% increase in a single year. When the Fever played, attendance jumped by 88% compared to games without her. Televised games on networks like ABC and ESPN averaged 1.3 million viewers, nearly triple the previous season's average. 19 of the 22 most watched games in the league's history involved the Indiana Fever. This wasn't just hype. This was a hostile takeover of the national consciousness. The status quo of the WNBA had always been one of sustainable growth, a slow climb toward relevance. Clark took that narrative and threw it out the window. By her presence alone, the overall value of the WNBA was estimated to have increased to nearly $1 billion. She was the reason for the landmark $2.2 billion media deal. She was the reason for the shift to chartered flights. She was the reason that merchandise sales spiked by over 700%. When we talk about the soul of her greatness, we are talking about the fact that she made it impossible for the world to ignore the Indiana Fever. She didn't just save a team, she validated an entire industry. Every record she broke was a nail in the coffin of the old era, proving that the Caitlin Clark effect wasn't a trend. It was the beginning of the most lucrative and high-stakes era in the history of the sport. The year 2024 was the earthquake. 2025 was the aftershock of resilience. But the Vultures, who predicted the Indiana Fever were a one-year wonder, have clearly ignored the blueprints being drawn inside the front office for the 2026 to 2028 seasons. We are no longer talking about a team trying to make the playoffs. We are talking about the construction of the WNBA's next great dynasty. A 3-year window designed to systematically dismantle the dominance of the Las Vegas Aces and the New York Liberty. This is the era of the Triple Crown: Clark, Boston, and Mitchell becoming the gold standard for professional basketball. The blueprint for this dynasty rests on the Big Three internal development. By 2026, we will see a Caitlin Clark who has fully transitioned from a collegiate phenom into a physical specimen. The mechanical overhaul we witnessed in her rookie year was just a prototype. With a full professional offseason focused on functional strength and recovery, the 2026 version of Clark will be an athlete who can no longer be bumped off her line. We are projecting a player who will consistently flirt with a 30-point, 12-assist average, operating within a system that has finally caught up to her processing speed. But a dynasty requires more than a superstar. It requires a structural hostile takeover of the roster. The 2025 season, despite the injury nightmare, served as a massive data collection exercise for the organization. They learned that the old guard surrounding the core needed to be replaced by high-IQ, positionless athletes who can survive the pace Clark dictates. The acquisition of Sophie Cunningham was the first shot across the bow, a move that signaled the Fever are prioritizing spacing and grit. Moving into 2026 and 2027, the Fever are positioned as the league's premier destination for free agents. Every elite shooter and mobile post player in the world now wants to play in Indianapolis, not just for the Clark effect marketing, but for the open looks that come with it. The long-term vision for the basketball marriage between Clark and Mitchell is to create the most prolific backcourt in the history of the sport. By 2027, Mitchell will be the seasoned veteran leader, the Tamika Catchings of this era, while Clark enters her absolute prime. Simultaneously, Aaliyah Boston will have evolved into the league's most immovable force in the paint, a defensive anchor who allows the Fever to play their high-risk, high-reward transition game. This is the hierarchy of the future, a team that doesn't just win games, but changes how the game is coached. The Vultures will point to the expansion draft and the rising salary cap as potential roadblocks. They will claim that super teams in other cities will rise to challenge them. But the Fever have something those teams don't: the gravity of a new order. The city of Indianapolis is no longer a basketball graveyard. It is the epicenter of the sport's cultural explosion. From 2026 to 2028, the Indiana Fever will likely be the first team in WNBA history to sell out every single home game for 3 consecutive years. This financial juggernaut allows the franchise to invest in unprecedented player amenities, from private travel to world-class recovery facilities, ensuring their stars stay healthy and hungry. The dynasty blueprint isn't just about winning a ring. It's about creating a 10-year vacuum where the Indiana Fever are the only team that matters. The Vultures are still looking at the standings. The Fever are looking at the history books. The transformation of the Indiana Fever is no longer a matter of opinion. It is a matter of history. But as the dust settles on this era of hostile takeover, we have to look at the scoreboard of the soul. Caitlin Clark didn't just save a franchise. She sacrificed her anonymity, her physical well-being, and her margin for error to drag a dying brand into the light. The Vultures, who spent 2 years waiting for her to fail, have been silenced by a simple, undeniable reality. The Indiana Fever are now the center of the basketball universe. From a 7-year playoff drought to becoming the league's premier powerhouse, the journey has been a masterclass in leadership. But every crown comes with a cost. We saw the cost in the 2025 season, the injury nightmare that saw Clark sidelined for the majority of the year. A casualty of the very pace and physicality she used to redefine the game. The psychological erosion of watching from the bench while the league moved forward without her was the final test. But even in her absence, the Clark effect remained the gravity of the league. The $22 billion media deal, the chartered flights, and the sold-out arenas in every city are the dividends of her arrival. She didn't just play a game. She brokered a new deal for every woman in the WNBA. The basketball marriage with Kelsey Mitchell and the structural evolution under Stephanie White have created a blueprint for a dynasty that will be studied for decades. They are no longer the lovable losers or the scrappy upstarts. They are the hunted. They are the team that every old guard legend and every rising expansion team, like the Golden State Valkyries, has circled in red on their calendar. The Indiana Fever are the standard, and the standard is a heavy thing to carry. So, we arrive at the final verdict. The Vultures are still out there, waiting for the next ankle sprain or the next locker room rumor to claim that the golden child has finally reached her limit. They will argue that the cost of this salvation, the total commercialization of the sport, and the intense, often toxic spotlight has fundamentally changed the game for the worse. They will say that the Indiana Fever didn't just find a savior, they sold their soul for a sellout streak. But here's the question that will drive the conversation for the next 10 years. And I want you to answer it in the comments. Is Caitlin Clark the greatest thing to ever happen to the WNBA? Or is the Caitlin Clark effect a double-edged sword that is currently breaking the very league she was sent to save? The numbers don't lie, but the legacy is still being written. The crown is on her head, and the target is on her back. the Indiana Fever are saved. But in this league, salvation is just the beginning of the war.